and welcome to podcast 36 of the Relationship Restaurant. We are Poppy and Jeff Spencer. Delighted to have you with us today. We're all about heart-healthy communication here, aren't we, Poppy?
Yes, and we're so excited today because even in the best of relationships, and sometimes when things go awry, we need to have those exquisite support systems in place. And our guest today, we're so excited to have her, is Morghan Richardson, who is a divorce attorney. She's a partner at Davidoff, Hutcher, and Citron LLP. She's been named by Super Lawyers as one of New York's rising stars, best attorneys who are 40 or under, for the last 5 years. That's pretty awesome.
Well done.
Morghan is an active member of the New York State Bar Association's new section, Women in the Law, and one of New York State's captains for nonpartisan volunteer group, Lawyer Moms of America. Morghan is also a divorced mom to 3 kids, and we are delighted to have her today, just in case anybody's thinking about divorce or even prenuptials, as we might venture into that area as well. Welcome, Morghan.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's exciting for us. Morghan, one of the things that Poppy and I, we do relationship counseling. We help people, and when people usually reach out to us, they're at a very often critical spot. They don't call us when things are great. They call us when things are tough, much like you. And so we're often trying to help them, as I know you have also tried to do, according to many of the things we've read in your bios, that you try to help them get things back in line. But so many times we both see that you can't do it. You can't get them back in line. And so often we have to be the ones passing the baton to you, the divorce attorney. And so we're delighted to have you on because it's something we have to do regularly.
A lot of times, one of the first questions I'll ask a potential client will be, have you tried couples counseling? Have you tried marriage counseling? Because I strongly feel that they should be able to say to themselves, I've done everything that I could do to save this relationship. And if they're at a point where they can say that and it's still not working, then they're in the right place. They should be talking to me. But if they feel like, maybe I haven't, maybe there's something left that I should have tried, then they might want to explore that before they come back to me, because it's worth a shot.
Right. I had a question about that, because sometimes we found that people will go through, and I use air quotes here, the motions of counseling as a way to sort of check it off this to-do list before I get divorced, even though their heart isn't really into it. Do you ever find that?
Sometimes I'll meet with somebody who's in the process of counseling, and they'll say, well, I'm trying this, but my heart isn't in it. And I'll say, a lot of times I can tell this isn't going to be successful because you've already checked out. Mm-hmm. You're not in it. You're not trying to save whatever the situation is, or maybe it just can't be saved. Maybe you've already processed that and you just are in a place where that relationship is done. You can definitely see that. I don't think that giving a try to therapy is a bad thing. I think that sometimes people can abuse that situation, and that's always a concern. If your spouse is tape recording the sessions or something like that to try to use that information in a divorce later, then you would have a real problem. But for the most part, I think most people want to say that they tried everything, and maybe it's a last-ditch effort, and maybe it's not their full effort, but I don't really necessarily fault them for that.
Right. One of the things that you talk about is, I know that you express a lot in your work, is divorce guilt. And I think that sometimes piggybacks with what we're just talking about, in that people will go to friends and family and coworkers perhaps and say, that's the first question someone else might ask. They might say, we didn't even know you guys were having problems. Did you ever try counseling? And then they can say, yes, we tried counseling. It didn't work, even though it is sort of a catch-all process that they went through.
And Morghan, I was just surprised. You said something about some people occasionally will record these things. Is that being done surreptitiously, where the other party doesn't know and just sort of hides that when they record it? I mean, because there shouldn't be anything that is allowed, I would imagine. We would never condone that.
Absolutely. I think as people, therapists and people should just know, hey, if we're going to do therapy, let's agree that this is not being tape recorded and that I am not authorizing you to tape record me in this session. I'm not authorizing the use of that. It's a particularly bad problem right now because it's so easy to record things on our cell phones.
Sure.
You can even see it playing out in national news cases. I know a few years ago there was that case of one of the kids from that family that has 18 kids or 20 kids or whatever. He was being tape recorded in the therapy sessions with his wife, and that sort of got leaked and then was being used against him for custody purposes. So it is an issue. If you're going to try a last-ditch effort for therapy, you would hope that it would be an honest one, or else you're never going to solve the problem.
So tell us a little bit more about divorce guilt. I know people are familiar with it, but maybe they're not really familiar with exactly what it is.
I like to think of it as this unresolved guilt that people can carry when they're getting rid of a relationship, that sometimes people might say, oh, your husband is fabulous. Why are you getting divorced? Or your wife is too good to be true. Why are you here? Why are you doing this? And I think it can drive people to make excuses or invent things where, nowadays you can really say it just didn't work out. But sometimes people feel like they can't just say, well, it just didn't work out. They need a reason. They need to have something there. And then they start to pick apart the things that have gone wrong and can spiral into something that's nasty that you don't want to deal with. And it's just an unresolved guilt issue, really. Being afraid to say what it is that you want or change the relationship for the better.
So could this be something that was latent in that person to begin with before they even entered marriage? Maybe childhood experiences that shaped them and became who they were, that they just have this sort of quality about them?
I'm not a therapist, so I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. But I see it a lot, and I think that it is not necessarily that there's something going on with that person, so much as it is part of the process of coming to terms with the fact that the relationship didn't work, and why didn't the relationship work, and is somebody to blame more than the other person? Some people seem to be more prone to wanting to have a highly dramatic breakup that's more like a Bravo show, and others are able to more quickly resolve that and say, okay, well, you know what, it actually really wasn't either of our fault, or, it was equally our fault. But that's something I don't need to focus on. I can just focus on trying to get to the bottom of how do we resolve this.
Okay.
So I think it's just an inherent part of the process, maybe more than it is the fault of the person who gets sucked into it. But I definitely see it a lot.
Well, a lot of people want to be able to answer that question in a very complete way when they get asked that tough question. Why are you doing it? You guys seem great. And sometimes they just feel a need to be able to explain further. But let me ask you something, because this is a question we've been wanting to ask. There's a lot of myths that people have about divorce, the process and the costs, everything else. Share with us some of these myths that people have.
I think a lot of people don't realize how complex the divorce process is, because the marriage process is super easy.
Mm-hmm.
You fill up the application, you say a few words, and you're good, you're married. And then the divorce process is just tons of paperwork involving your Social Security numbers, involving your assets, your liabilities, your kids. Every decision you've made as a marital, decision as a married couple is being called into question. And that can take a lot of time. So I would think one of the myths that, maybe the attorneys are profiting and forcing this into a longer process than it needs to be, that's definitely not true. It can take quite a bit of time for somebody who's an outsider to your life to come in and say, okay, how do we fix this? How do we resolve these issues and divide things, especially if the two parties are not cooperating with each other?
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. And I think the second thing, and I can't stress this enough, I have to focus on this quite frequently, is that divorce is not a process of revenge. Going to court to get your divorce is not going to punish your spouse. It's not about punishing your spouse. So if you've had problems in your relationship and you have resentments that have built up over the years of your marriage, you're not getting even with your spouse by going to court. If anything, it's a punishment to both of you,
Mm-hmm.
because we're saying as a society, you two can't figure this stuff out, your life out on your own. So now we have to get involved, we the people, we the court system, and it's not a pleasant process for either of you. So I wouldn't look to the courts as a place to find revenge for petty things that have happened in your marriage. That That's not our job. Our job is to try to determine what's a reasonable schedule for the kids to have, because most likely they're going to go back and forth between the two of you.
Right.
And how are we going to somewhat fairly divide what you have and who gets support? I think I said it was the second myth, but it's probably the biggest myth, because it really isn't a place for seeking revenge.
So how do you work with your clients then who still can't get past their anger? It consumes them, or the revenge. How do you work with them? Does it elongate the divorce process because that's such a stumbling block?
Oh, definitely. I think if you go into it with that mindset, you will have the longest possible divorce process that you can imagine, because it's going to involve probably not just me, but it'll involve you becoming disillusioned with a number of different attorneys who can't provide for you that level of satisfaction that you're looking for, because it's not something that we can deliver.
Right.
So you'll go to your first attorney, then you'll fire me, then you'll go to your second attorney, then your third attorney, then your fourth attorney. So usually if someone comes to me and they've had 5 or 6 attorneys, I am a little skeptical about what may be going on there.
I'd be really skeptical.
We actually are working with a client who has his ex worked with 6 attorneys. So yeah, I can't imagine getting a 7th attorney. I can't even imagine. Just a little disclosure, self-disclosure there. Both Jeff and I have been married and divorced twice. We are now happily married to each other. And we are very close with our exes. I've never disparaged them. We talk about this all the time. We've stayed at my ex's home. We've had them here for dinner.
We were recently up in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where Poppy's from, and I played a round of golf with Poppy's first ex.
Yeah, so we are just, and it's always, always for the best interest of the kids, whether you're divorced or not. And that's something else I wanted to get into a little bit with you, because there's so many times that the male and female personalities differ on what's best for the kids. And so I know you see this as well too. So can you give us maybe a highlight a story that you've had where that's been shown, where the mom doesn't feel that the dad is doing the right thing, and not enough time, or whatever? We hear about Disney dads all the time.
I mean, I think sometimes that stems from this relationship dynamic so I have a client, I'll call her Jan. That's not her real name. But when the children were born, Jan decided, I'm going to stay home with the kids. You know, it made sense for their family financially. They didn't want to spend money on 2 kids being in daycare, that, Jan really wasn't making enough to cover the cost, or be barely covering the cost of that. And the more she was home with the kids, the more she felt like she was in tune with them, and things had to be done a certain way. And whenever her husband, Mark, would try to take over or try to help with those things, he wouldn't do it right. He wouldn't do it exactly her way, down to, like he's not feeding the kids the right kind of food. I only feed this organic brand of oatmeal. And he bought them some frozen dinners. In her mind, that amounted to like child abuse, like these frozen dinners.
Yeah, that Quaker Oats versus the other one is a big problem.
Right. And I think that's a common dynamic that a lot of people sometimes find themselves in when they have that sort of more traditional male-female caretaker versus out-of-the-home provider. The woman tends to slip into this, well, what I'm doing and the way I'm doing it is best for the kids, and it must absolutely be done this way. And then it starts to make their partner feel like, well, I don't know anything about how to care for these kids. It sort of reinforces that. And then they get frustrated that they can't help. And then they don't want to help because they're being told, well, you're committing abuse by giving them TV dinner.
Or there's no way to win.
Right, exactly. Rather than just accepting the help and saying, you know what, that's one meal I don't have to make, so I'm not going to care what he fed them. They're fed and they're alive and they're fine. So I think that dynamic can really fester into a lot of resentment, because meanwhile, Mark goes out into the workforce and he sees women who have kids and work. Well, he can't really tell exactly what his wife is doing all day, other than, the precise feeding schedule that she's on with the kids. He can't really see what the contribution is to having her at home, and how are they able to feed their kids the precise things that they need to be fed. but also work. So,
Yes.
That dynamic is not really healthy for anyone for the most part. It takes a lot of work to keep it from building into a resentment. And then they end up in losing sight of each other in this sort of increasing spiral. And that results in them breaking up. And then her saying, well, he's never cared for these kids. He doesn't know how. He's not equipped to. But you never allowed him the chance to do it. You never gave him the opportunity, and you never helped facilitate that. So how could you ever expect anything different,
Right. Well, so in that case scenario, do those couples inevitably end up sitting in your office?
One or the other of them does, for sure. I think, and that's part of the heart and the difference between a collaborative divorce or a mediated divorce versus a contested situation. If the couple is able to come to me as just a mediator rather than an attorney, and they're really able to put the needs of their kids first and say, we don't want them to be in the middle of this. We want to dissolve our relationship while keeping our focus on the kids. They can have a much more amicable situation, one like you just described. And quite frankly, that's my divorce experience as well. My ex-husband lives a few blocks away, comes over for dinner. Sometimes he'll let himself in and he'll be making breakfast while I'm getting the kids ready in the morning. It's a very amicable back and forth because we focused on putting our kids first and not our personal sort of petty problems with each other.
Right. And sometimes that's even better, that they're better parents all the way around after the divorce. So we've written a couple of articles on that, where don't forsake the ex for the sake of the kids. And absolutely are huge advocates of nurturing and protecting the kids at all costs and their well-being. Obviously never arguing in front of them and creating turmoil. So I'm glad you talked about collaborative divorce, because that is something that most people want to do until somebody gets the ear of one of the two parties, and then they go, no, man, they're going to take you to the cleaners, or vice versa. And then what happens? Then the collaborative divorce goes out the window, right?
Yeah. I mean, I still advise my clients to always try to take the high road, because the better parent is the one that continues to stay focused on the best interests of the kids, no matter what the other parent is doing. And a lot of times, I think that the judge will see that. They'll see that the one person is struggling really to continue this high road approach, to continue to put the kids' needs first, and you're the better parent for it. And the court will recognize that. So even if you're in that situation, it's important to try to maintain that for yourself and for your kids, rather than getting baited into, a tit for tat. Well, he did this, so I'm going to do that, kind of situation.
Right.
One of the things, Morghan, when we have people that are clearly look like they're not going to be able to resolve their differences in talking to us, or often it's just one party comes to us and just says, hey, my husband is just someone I don't think I can work with. And we talk to him and we try to get an understanding of where it is. And we always try to figure out when is the best time, the appropriate, if there is a best time for us to point a person your direction.
In terms of whether or not they should continue in the therapy process or not, or whether or not they should just move to the divorce attorney process, I definitely would suggest that they talk to an attorney before they do any sort of trial separation.
Mm-hmm.
I've had this discussion with other therapists before, because apparently that might be a healthy way for them to get some space, and maybe it might save their relationship. But from a legal perspective, when the two of you separate, you're triggering different legal rights and triggering things that might happen in the case. So you need to know that before you separate, because if one of you moves out and leaves the kids with the other person, that person may have de facto custody. Right. That person may have a stronger claim to say, I want exclusive use and occupancy now, you can't come back home. So you might be triggering different things from a legal perspective. So before they do that, any kind of trial separation, and maybe they're doing it in a good faith way. They think it's going to help their relationship. They think it's going to maybe save their marriage. They still are triggering these things, and they should know that.
And it brings up another point, too, of when a lot of times people will say, well, one of us is going to move out and I'm just going to take the kids. I know certainly in many states, you cannot do that. The kids have to stay in the family home, right?
That may be very dependent on a state-by-state situation. Here, for example, if someone's going to move out and take the kids, first thing I want to know if I'm involved in the case at all is, what's the access schedule? Are we saying you're just taking them? What does that mean, you're taking the kids? Because when you're married to each other, at least in the view of the state of New York, you both have equal rights to the kids. You're both equal custodial parents. So at the point where somebody's taking the kids, whether or not they're leaving them there or they're taking them with them, that's triggering something, and the lawyers need to be involved just to make sure everybody's protected and things are thought through.
And that's such a good point. So audiences should listen and find out their own state's legalities before taking the kids and just going.
Well, once again, as Megan was saying, talk to the attorneys before you do any of these things so you understand exactly what your rights are. I
think in the state of Florida, where we live, you can't take the kids out of the residential home.
And it's possible, too, that you could even just have a discussion with your attorneys, maybe even draft an agreement that's temporary separation agreement, or separation of the houses agreement, or something that your lawyers can come up with that would provide an access schedule, that would provide the terms of who's paying what bills, while you're attempting to just do this, hey, let's do a trial separation. So that way there's some sort of foundation so that if things go wrong, you're protected.
So one of the things that always comes up first, and what really people stumble upon, is the finances. They can't see how money is going to factor into a trial separation or an impending divorce. They don't know what to do. And because that money is such a scary, taboo subject for so many, they avoid it, and then they just stay in this very unhealthy dynamic. So what can people do to understand the finances?
I would definitely say that they cannot ignore the finances.
Right.
That never results in anything good. But money is a very difficult thing for couples to talk about because it usually results in conflict. And I think a lot of times that means that people develop ways of talking about it that, it's a low conflict. They try to make it as low conflict as possible, even if it means they're sacrificing information.
Right. And so they talk in nuanced terms instead of directly, which is mudding it so badly.
They need to have some guidelines or parameters for how they're going to talk. I like to call it a dirty money conversation.
Like that.
How do you talk dirty if you're married? You talk about money.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to set aside time weekly or monthly to have a conversation about the finances, to get an honest look at what's happening, what credit cards there are, what bills there are that you might not have known about, what's the status on the savings and college savings and the mortgage and all of those things. Both parties need to do that because this is a partnership. Marriage is a financial partnership just like an emotional one. So you need to set aside that time and try to do that. And if you're having difficulty doing that, you really need to enlist the help of someone to facilitate those conversations.
Right. So tell us a story about a case study with money and misunderstandings and how, a lot of people, there's certainly money myths out there that people say, well, I'm just going to empty the bank account right now before I file for divorce. Or,
Make sure I get it first.
So tell us about that.
So under the banking laws, if you have a joint bank account, either party can fully drain that account, and that's under banking laws. But divorce law isn't the same as banking law. So we're going to look at any draining of the accounts right before the filing, and we're going to make you put back at least half of that money. So moving the money around right before your case might not help you. What's really tricky, though, is if people are anticipating the divorce far enough out, years out, then they might start doing things that are small changes in what they're spending and sort of hiding money and that kind of thing in cash. And that can be very sticky situation. So having open and honest discussions about the finances and really looking at the numbers will prevent either party from doing that. But in terms of it goes back to that dynamic again where one party may be staying at home and the other party may be working. One party usually is going to be naturally better at managing the finances and handling the bills than the other So then you start to rely on that person to juggle those things and you become less involved. And that's where you sort of make a bad mistake because you're not involved and you don't necessarily know what's happening. And it allows for either abusive spending or misspending or hiding of assets. And it also just gives that other person a huge advantage when they're going into a divorce because they know exactly what's happening with the finances and you don't.
Right. They've kind of shielded the other person from it, yeah.
Morghan, when should somebody first contact an attorney? When should they first come to you? Even when they're just contemplating divorce but not sure if they haven't even gone to counseling yet, should they still contact an attorney?
I meet with people in all different phases of relationship distress. So, yeah, if they are just, it's just starting to dawn on them that maybe a divorce is in their future and they have that thought like, you know what, I wonder what would happen. A lot of times people will turn to Google and they'll just start Googling. And Google is much like, it is for a doctor. It's the same for a lawyer. Google. Yeah, it's not ever going to tell you you have this and this is your problem. It's never going to do that for you on a legal side either, because the law is not just, hey, this is what the statute says. The law is also applying the law to the facts.
Right.
So we need to know what the facts of your situation are to apply the law to figure out what's going to happen in your specific case.
Right.
You might be thinking about it and you might wonder if you're going to be inclined to spend, 4 or 5 hours on Google, you may as well make an appointment with me and we'll just get it over with in one shot. And I'll tell you, this is your situation and this is what I think you'd be looking at.
If you had to pick one thing, what's the best advice you could give your client?
In terms of someone who's facing a divorce?
Yes.
In terms of the best advice, I mean, that's a hard one because everybody's case is different. I think, though, you have to go into the experience realizing that you can come out of it better. You're not going into this and your life is over. There is a life after this divorce is over. There is hope after it's over. Your whole life is not ruined. Just a turn in the road that you maybe weren't expecting. You didn't necessarily want to end up there, but it's still going to be a great adventure because I see a lot of people that are very, very depressed. This isn't what they expected. This isn't what they wanted for themselves or their kids. And that's a process that they have to sort of emotionally run through. But if they allow themselves to do it, then when they come out of this process, they're just better off.
It's interesting to have you say that because that's so much of what we do when people are going through divorce is we're just always there on the sidelines, encouraging them that they will be okay. There will be light at the end of the tunnel. It's hard right now, but you can. That's one of the reasons why Poppy and I are doing what we're doing, why we wrote a book about finding each other again after many years and giving people hope that you can have great romance later in life. And so it's something we are always prompting people to keep believing that there is going to be a better situation for them.
What we do is we give people that sort of that clarity and awareness to help them identify the tolerable things in their relationship and the ones that they're intolerant of. And we help them either come to your door or we help them reclaim that intimacy and uniqueness in their own relationships. So one last thing before we go, Morghan, I know you said you have a secret weapon that you use that's so critical in any divorce proceeding, and it's not what people think. So tell us what it is.
Yeah, and I have a blog post on this topic. My secret weapon really is quite simple. It's a calculator, because a lot of times people will get very caught up in the emotional side of their divorce. For example, you're the custodial parent. You really get tied up with, I need to keep this house.
Yes.
This is the children's house. This is the only home they've ever known. And it's so important to them. And you just throw everything, all of your effort into keeping the house. But if you do the math, you would actually be better off letting go of the house and figuring out different things that you can do financially in the divorce that make that work. And sometimes people can't see that. So I like to run through the numbers. I like to show them the calculations, and then we try to talk about it and whether or not it makes sense financially and it doesn't make sense to them emotionally. That's a disconnect, and that's something they may need to start working on. People think, well, the kids need to stay in that house. Well, kids are very resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And they also, you may have all of these emotional memories and things tied to the house, but some of them might not be that great.
Right.
I mean, the
exactly.
kids, the kids might be happy to say goodbye to the house
Yeah,
at the end of the day.
This is the room where mom and dad always fought.
Right, exactly.
So we worked with a client for about 4 months just before she contacted an attorney, and it was these words that made us really encourage her to reach out to an attorney. And she said, you know what? I just want my kids. I don't care about any money or the house. I just want my kids. And we're like holding up our fingers perpendicular, like,
No. You need to care about that too.
We need to care about them because you're not going to have anything to give to your kids if you don't. So
right. How will you take care of them?
Exactly. So we helped her. Let us manage your raw emotions. Understandable, they're raw emotions, but let's get you appropriate legal guidance so that you can make a good decision, and we'll take care of managing your emotions. And we actually ended up working with her during mediation and at the divorce table. We actually sat in with her to help quell those, she's very sensitive, and quell those emotions. And the mediator actually was very positive. She said, wow, I've never seen that happen where it went so smoothly and things were brought up and out, and both parties agreed to a really decent settlement, and it worked out great. I mean, there were some ridiculous things that came up, like, I don't want to drive an extra 3 miles for visitation swap unless I get this. And we're like, okay, wait, we have to like time out here and bring her back to some reasonable, logical things in. And as you said, take that emotion out of it. And I'm sure you do that all the time.
I think that's an interesting point. We're attorneys and we're really trained to deal with the legal side of this, but so much of what's happening in divorce is really emotional and is really something that you need to handle with care, and that maybe therapist involvement isn't a bad idea, because I'm a very expensive therapist.
Mm-hmm.
My hourly rate is a little steep for that. And I think a lot of times people don't realize the divorce process isn't just a legal problem you have to solve. It's also an emotional one.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, that's where we've had many people, attorneys will direct people our direction for exactly that reason, to say, hey, these people will be much better at discussing the emotions and handling those emotions at a more reasonable price point, as you already pointed out.
And because we have a parenting certification and 5 children between us, I used to teach parenting classes and all that, and help children navigate blended families, divorced families, all of that, with the idea of the children epicenter of well-being. People resonate with that. It's really helpful.
Can't thank you enough for being a part of our show and sharing your insights. It's been wonderful to have you here.
So, Morghan Richardson, divorce attorney, where can people find you?
My blog is thedivorceartist.com, and my firm is Davidoff, Hutcher & Citron, LLP. The website is dhclegal.com.
So that's D like David, H like Harry, C like Charlie, legal.com?
Yes.
Okay.
So either of those 2 locations, you'll definitely see me hanging around.
And tell us about, is there a free consultation, or is the first consultation?
I do have a discounted hourly rate for my first consultation, but I think that it signals to me how serious the person is,
right,
if they're willing to pay for the consultation.
Good point.
Right. I don't want them to waste their time, and I don't want to waste my time. But I also think it helps them have a little skin in the game. Like,
yes,
Are you really thinking about this? This isn't just some frivolous, like, oh, I was bored today and I thought I'd check out what might happen.
I think it's a great investment to have that consultation. I mean, several $100s to get information, to get a little blink into the future of what might happen and how this might go down. It's well worth the investment.
It's well worth the investment. Again, Morghan, thank you so much. We're delighted to have you here on the Relationship Restaurant. And until next time, we're Poppy and Jeff Spencer. And we look forward to having our next guest and having you, our audience, enjoy some more great insights.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Morghan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.